Well, let's talk about Jay Powell because he's not an economist.
I think he's the most effective con man we've had running the Fed for a long time. He has convinced the public that he knows what he's doing and that all this inflation we had was caused by unusual distortions from the pandemic, had nothing to do with him. It's just nonsense. The press is bought into this totally. Powell and the other influential central bankers basically tell them what to cover. It's all propaganda. Performance of the Fed has been a complete disaster, one of the worst performances that we've ever had. And now we have this huge contraction in the money supply. We've only had 4 contractions ever since the Fed was established in 1913, and all those led to recessions. One actually, the Great Depression. If it's not sustainable and you keep kicking it down the road, you're going to eventually meet the day of reckoning when the whole thing explodes.
Steve Hanke, professor of applied economics at Johns Hopkins University, says the day of reckoning is coming. They can't keep kicking the can down the road. Now, Steve knows a lot about the economy and the games that they play with your money. Steve served as a member of President Ronald Reagan's Council of Economic Advisors. He was advisor to 5 foreign heads of state and 5 foreign cabinet ministers. He was president of Toronto Trust Argentina in Buenos Aires, the world's best performing mutual fund in 1995. And at present, Steve Hanke is noted as the 3rd most influential economist in the world, according to Focus Economics in Barcelona. And Steve says we're at a point that he thinks that a recession just can't be prevented. So have a listen to what you should do to prepare and benefit from the next U.S. economic downturn. I hope you enjoy the show. Steve Hanke, welcome back to our show.
Good to be with you, Todd.
It's been a while since we've chatted. There's nothing short of topics to talk about with the economy, the U.S. economy specifically. A lot going on with, looks like the presidential campaign is well on its way and lots of mudslinging. And of course, you know, I'm a real estate broker. We're really seeing where things are changing, especially it seems like almost in the last 2 or 3 weeks, we've really seen the faucet shut off, and we're hearing a lot of the same, sort of sentiments from our buyers. And now it's interesting. We're seeing a record. The inventory shot up, homes inventory shot up, and now we're seeing it kind of flatten out and in some markets decline because the sellers are frustrated that they haven't sold their house right away. But can you just kind of give us, since the last time we spoke, it's been a couple months. I mean, what's your opinion, on the current course of the U.S. economy?
Well, let's start by focusing on real estate a little bit, because it ties into the general economic scene. And I've had requests, actually, a number of people have written me wanting to know where I think mortgage rates are going. And mortgage rates are going down. And the reason for that gets into this thing that I stress all the time, and that is the economy is all about what we call monetarism. Money is the fuel that makes the economy go around. And if you slow the money supply rate of growth down, the nominal GDP goes down. Now, what I mean by nominal GDP, GDP has 2 components. One is the real rate of growth in the economy, and then you have to add to that whatever the inflation is. And if you add those 2 things, real growth and inflation growth together, you get the growth in nominal GDP. And that rate of growth is all dependent on what's been happening to the money supply a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, maybe 2.5 years ago. So if the money supply is going down and contracting, which actually it is right now, the stock of money in the U.S. economy is less than it was in July of 2022. Now that's very unusual, by the way. That's only happened 4 times in the history of the Federal Reserve. That's since 1913. There have only been 4 prior contractions. You have to go all the way back to late 1940s to find the first contraction. Then we had another one in the 30s, and then, of course, a huge 1929, 1933. That was the Great Depression. That was a huge contraction in the money supply, and then we had one in the 1920s, another contraction. All of those things led to recessions. So where we're going, we had, of course, this huge increase in the money supply, and we had inflation. And now we have this huge contraction in the money supply, and inflation is coming down. I mean, it's at 2.9% right now, the headline consumer price index number. And John Greenwood and I think that'll end up the year between 2.5 and 3% per year. So I think we pretty much, our forecast is going to be confirmed by what's going on, and going way back to when inflation kicked up, the money supply peaked out, growing at an unprecedented rate, 27% year over year rate of growth in February of 2021. And that was followed by what? It was followed by a pickup in inflation. Greenwood and I, at that time, made a forecast. We said it would go up as high as 9%. It actually went up to 9.1%. So we hit the bullseye there. We're clearly going to hit the bullseye on the downside too. And why? Because monetarism. It's the money supply, stupid. You have to look at these changes in the money supply, and then with a lag of a year or 2 years, you get changes in inflation, that inflation component of nominal GDP. So this is coming back to mortgages. Now, if inflation is coming down, that means that yields on bonds and mortgage rates will come down because they follow inflation. Inflation comes first, you get a change in the money supply. Then with a big lag, you get a change in inflation. And then you ultimately get a change in bond yields or and other interest rates like mortgages. So what we've had, the 10-year U.S. government bond is probably the most important one, the key interest rate for long-term interest rates, and that was up, 5%. I started recommending buying those 10-year bonds when the yield was 4.8%. Now it's about 3.7%. So inflation has come down. The yield on the 10-year has come way down. And if the yield comes down, by the way, the price of the bond goes up. So anyone who had followed my advice and been investing in those long-term 10-year bonds had not only was collecting a good yield, but they had a nice little capital gain on that trade. So that's where we are on the housing market. As far as giving particular advice, I don't do that because the local markets are also particular and shall we say, have their own characteristics, which me not knowing what the characteristics are, there's really no advice I can give. The only advice I can give is mortgage rates, I think, will continue to come down. So I think, and for real estate, either buyers or sellers, you can put that in your pipe and smoke it, and it's going to be true.
When you're talking about the money supply, you're talking more specifically about M2?
Yeah, M2 is the broadest measure of money in the United States, and about 10% of M2 is made up of currency, notes and coins that are produced by the Federal Reserve, and then about 75%, a little over 75%, is made up of deposits, liquid deposits at banks, and of course banks create those when they make a loan to Todd Sachs. What happens? Your checking account gets topped up, and so private banks create those liquid deposits. You also have savings accounts included, and also retail money market accounts are included in them too. So notes and coins, about 10%. The Fed, that's what the Fed produces. The rest is all in the private sector. The big elephant in the room are liquid deposits in commercial banks. Basically checking accounts.
When you're talking about the contraction of that, I mean, what exactly? I mean, is that just because people don't have any more coins and money in their accounts? I mean, that it was eaten up by inflation?
No, it isn't notes and coins. It's what's happened to the deposits in the banking system. And if the non-bank public doesn't have as much money in their checking accounts, well, they basically don't have as much firepower. I mean, think about it that way. Think of it. The As I say, the big elephant in the room, Todd, is liquid checking accounts and banks. Let's say roughly 75-80% of M2, the broad measure of money that's held by the public. Now, if the amount of money that's held by the public is shrinking, that means their firepower is shrinking. If your checking account it goes, think of it on an individual basis. If your checking account is going down and shrinking, what do? If you're
Stop spending.
Yeah, you hunker down. Now, if you're not prudent, maybe you would say, well, you go to the bank and try to get a loan to top it up. But generally, in the broad scheme of things, it's fuel for the furnace, and fuel is going down. We're kind of running on fumes, basically, and that's why not only Greenwood and I think that the inflation rate will end up the year at 2.5% to 3% in the United States, and probably go lower next year than the Fed's 2% target. That's the target of the Fed, is to 2%. And we think there's a pretty good chance that inflation will actually come in somewhere below 2% because of this money contraction that we've been witnessing. So that's where we are in inflation. And Greenwood and I think we also have a recession that's baked in the cake for the reason that I gave you earlier. You contract the money supply. We've only had 4 contractions ever since the Fed was established in 1913, and all those led to recessions. One, actually, the Great Depression was a result of money contraction.
All right, so let's talk about the recession that you're suggesting, and it makes sense. I mean, looking at the Fed charts, you could see certainly when everybody was on lockdown and there was an influx of stimulus that was being handed out, and we saw people were being subsidized on unemployment. And we watched an all-time high in the savings account. And, of course, it makes sense. We had record inflation. And, of course, it depleted all that again. When you're talking about recession, I think we really started seeing a lot of businesses feel the effects, I believe, talking to business owners last October, November, somewhere around there. We've seen reports on consumer spending still being strong. I don't know how much you can believe in the reports, but now it seems like it really is worse. I mean, where people were still not feeling the pain as much, now we're starting to see delinquency rates go up, foreclosures happening now despite all the loan forbearances. We'll kind of start. I want to start with the opinion of when Fed, and I want to talk about J-Powell a little bit. But when we're talking about the Fed and company, J-Powell and company, the Federal Reserve, talking about the ability to soft land this plane, and we're talking about the contraction of the money supply, do you think that their next move will be expansion of the money supply? And I know I've heard you talk about to me, the delay in when you see expansion and contraction, maybe the contraction has a little bit more delay than the expansion phase if they were to decide to do more quantitative easing. Do you think that at this point, with inflation being so vulnerable at this point, what do you think their next move will be to try and avoid this recession?
Well, the thing they focus on incorrectly are interest rates, the federal funds rate, and I think it's pretty clear that in September they're going to lower the federal funds rate. Right now, it's kind of a, if you look at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, the futures market for federal funds, it's about a 50-50 split, whether they'll reduce some 25 basis points, a quarter of a percent or a half a percent. So the market thinks that there's about an equal chance of a 50 basis point reduction or a 25 basis point reduction, but a reduction is in the cards. The problem is monetary policy, the tenor of monetary policy is not given by interest rates. It's given by changes in the money supply. And Powell and the Fed they don't look at the money supply. They're just focused on, they're what's called data dependent, and they're looking at current data and trying to basically put their finger in the wind every day, looking at data coming out every single day, and making some kind of judgment about what to do about monetary policy. And for them, monetary policy is a change in federal funds rates. It should be focused on what do you do to change the rate of growth in the money supply. And by the way, the money supply is growing at year over year less than 1% right now. And Hanke's golden growth rate, a rate that's consistent with hitting the Fed's inflation target of 2%, is 6%. So M2, if everything would have been from the pandemic on growing at M2 at about 6%, inflation would have stayed around 2%. We would have never had the up and now this downward movement in the inflation rate. But that they don't look at the money supply. They don't embrace what I referred to earlier in our conversation, Todd, as monetarism. They're in charge of monetary policy, but they don't embrace monetarism. In other words, they don't think that there's a linkage between changes in the money supply and the stock of money in the economy and economic activity and inflation, which is just completely nonsense. I mean,
maybe they don't want people to have money.
Chairman Powell just gave a speech last week in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, at this big confab they have out there every year. And he said that inflation was caused by distortions that resulted from the pandemic. He never mentioned money. He never mentioned the fact that they goosed the money supply and had it growing at 27% on an annual basis, the highest rate that it's ever grown, by the way.
Well, let's talk about Jay Powell because he's not an economist. And I think prior to him, it was 40 years before that that we had a non-economist running the Federal Reserve. What's your opinion on that?
Well, Powell's trained as a lawyer. He isn't an economist. But I think the thing that's interesting to me, in a way, I think he's the most effective con man we've had at running the Fed for a long time, because he has convinced the press and the public that he knows what he's doing, and that all this inflation we had was caused by unusual distortions that resulted from the pandemic, had nothing to do with him, and everyone buys it. If you read the press, that's what's in the press, and the public actually thinks they have a halo over Powell's head. I think they should have a pointed cap over his head. The performance of the Fed in the 2020-2024 period has been a complete disaster. One of the worst performances of the Fed that we've ever had. But that's not what the public thinks. The public is more or less bought into this non-monetarist idea about what causes inflation. And the reason, of course, that Powell and the Fed tells that story and that narrative goes around, they don't want the inflation monkey to be on their back. They People don't like inflation, so the Fed obviously wants to point the finger at somebody else for causing it. It's the old line. It's not me. It's the guy behind the tree.
So I think it's fair to say you don't think he's done a good job, and I think that this will probably go down as one of the probably some of the biggest mistakes that we've made or the Fed has made. Do you think there's a conflict of interest with the Federal Reserve? I mean, the Federal Reserve is made up of the banks. I mean, is there a conflict of interest in the decisions that they make as bankers versus monetarism?
I don't know about the conflict of interest. That gets off in a whole nother realm. My concern is that they are not embracing monetarism, and they're not paying any attention to the quantity theory of money, which has been around since the 16th century. I mean, anyone running a good central bank historically has always paid a lot of attention to what was going on with the money supply. Now, the modern view is generally, not universally, but generally, all the central bankers have poo-pooed the quantity theory of money, and they claim there's very little connection between changes in the money supply and changes in economic activity and changes in inflation, which is just wrong. It's just nonsense. But you read this every day. You pick up the New York Times or even the Wall Street Journal or Financial Times, and you'll read nothing about changes in the money supply. It's just not covered. They'll be covering what Powell and the other influential central bankers basically tell them to cover. So the story is told by the storytellers, and the storytellers are the central bankers. That's the problem.
Hmm.
It's all It's basically propaganda, and it's quite astounding now that the press is bought into this totally, and one reason for that, of course, if you're a reporter and your assigned beat is the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England or the European Central Bank or one of these central banks, you have to have access. You want to be able to talk to people at the Fed, and to get access, the price is that you have to buy the narrative that they're feeding you. Now, the good reporters would report the narrative, but in the old days, if you had a good reporter, they would also get contrary opinion and have it in there. So it wasn't a one-way ticket. They would have a, let's say, balance in their reporting. Now it's straight the Fed line, 100%.
I kind of feel like that's the same in politics with the politicians.
Well, this is why that Hanke's 95% rule. We've just started this week, by the way. Johns Hopkins, my classes have just started, and one of the first things I will tell the students in economics and finance classes is that 95% rule. 95% of what you read in the press is either wrong or irrelevant. So you have to be very careful with what you're reading, and it's very easy to get tripped up.
Well, I think that's because people don't look deeper.
This gets into the data dependency thing. So every day they're reporting whatever the news is that's coming out, but those daily reports are data that are symptoms of something that's been caused a long time before, and that the causal factor is the money supply. So the money supply changes a year ago, year and a half, 2 years ago, and that causes changes in these economic data that are reported. And then the data, of course, sometimes you get huge revisions. A week ago, we had a massive revision in the jobs in the United
Yeah.
States, and they took it down by 800,000. So this they'd been reporting data one way, it looked pretty strong, and all of a sudden, boom, there was a reduction of 27% reduction in the number of jobs that we'd had over the last year. So that if you're data dependent and the data are bad, you got a real problem. And if you're data dependent, you're really looking in the rear view mirror all the time anyway, because those data that you're looking at, even if they're accurate, they were caused by something that happened a long time ago, changes in the money supply. So the Fed's always looking in the rear view mirror, basically. They're behind the curve all the time. And that's why you get these ups and downs in the money supply. The money supply goes up, down, up, down, up, down. Inflation goes up, down, up, down. When we had Alan Greenspan, for example, now Greenspan was a trained economist, and he kept the money supply growing at a pretty constant rate in the 1990s when he was chairman. And what happened? Surprise, inflation was hovering around the inflation target of 2%. It wasn't going up and down and up and down. It was staying, pretty constant, actually a little below target. So as they say, Todd, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And if you look at the record of somebody like Greenspan, it was pretty good, and it was pretty good because he kept the money supply growing pretty close to Hanke's golden growth rate of M2 growth of about 6% per year.
Yeah, it really makes no sense that we wouldn't have people doing a better job. In these
And his
positions.
job was made easier, by the way, because remember, you had Clinton. Clinton was the president, and the Speaker of the House was Newt Gingrich. So you had two fairly clever politicians going head to head, and as a result, you you had Robert Rubin was a Secretary of Treasury. So you had Greenspan, Robert Rubin, kind of the technical people at Treasury and the Fed, and then you had Clinton in the White House and Newt Gingrich, Speaker on the Congress. Now, what happened? Well, they more or less, Clinton went down as the most fiscally conservative president, his administration, than we've had since World War II. The last 2 years of the Clinton administration, remember, the U.S. was running surpluses, actually.
Yeah.
Remember the big thing everybody was worried about then? They said, "Oh, they're not going to be issuing any bonds, and there won't be any liquid 10-year bonds to be buying. What are we going to do about that?" So everyone on Wall Street was wringing their hands about that. Well, that didn't last very long.
What do you think about our debt? I mean, I interesting. I just podcasted not too long ago with one of your cohorts, Dr. Laffer, and we were talking about debt, and he really said, which I was surprised. He said that the debt really didn't matter. That that debt was a good thing, and that you can't focus on the amount of debt. And despite the fact that the rate of interest, if we keep going, sometime in the near future, the interest on our nation's debt will outweigh what they bring in tax revenue, and so much of our payroll tax, our withholding tax, goes towards paying this debt deficit. I mean, what do you think about the rate of debt that we have right now? And I mean, is it a good thing or?
No, it's a bad thing. Number one, the debt always has to be paid off. Now, a lot of people say, "Well, we owe it to ourselves." So they go through a lot of sophistry, arguing that, well, we owe it to ourselves, and 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 we really never have to pay it off. Well, you always have to pay it off, and the interest, by the way, is something that's paid by taxpayers. They get nothing for it.
It's inflation.
They're just pay the taxes are collected. The money goes to pay bondholders who are holding the bonds, and nothing is produced. I mean, it's just money down the rat hole. So, my friend Art Laffer and I, obviously, if that's what Art said, we disagree. I mean, the debt is a big problem, and even the Congressional Budget Office, which is a nonpartisan kind of technocratic outfit, the Congressional Budget Office says it's not sustainable. We can't keep going like this. I agree. It isn't sustainable. And if something isn't sustainable, it will stop. And and how will we stop it? Well, right now, the way the thing is set up, there are only three ways to stop the deficit and control a debt level. And one would be to reduce and control government spending. So that's one possibility. Another possibility is to increase taxes. That would close the deficit. And there are two ways to tax. One is direct taxes that you pay to the IRS. The other is indirect taxes, the inflation tax. So the three things: you want to stop the growth in the deficit that is not sustainable. And you do that by either cutting government spending down and reining it in, increasing direct taxes, or increasing the inflation tax. Now, I think there's another option, and one that would solve the problem. And that is, if you go to Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, we could have a convention of states, and that convention of states would meet and focus narrowly on this deficit debt problem. And hopefully, they would come to the conclusion that we should change the Constitution and have some kind of something like a Swiss debt break put in the Constitution. Now, in 2001, the Swiss did exactly this. They have referenda in Switzerland. They always have had. And so they had a referenda, and the referenda was on the Swiss debt break. And it passed with a huge majority, and the Constitution was changed in 2001. And that change is that government spending in Switzerland can't go up any more rapidly than the rate of growth in the economy. Point number one. And point number two is that over the intermediate term, 3 or 4 years, the budget has to be balanced in Switzerland. They can't run deficits year after year. Over a 2, 3, 4 year period, the thing has to balance. So that is the real solution. And
I love that they're incentivized.
Yeah,
they're actually incentivized.
You make a change in the Constitution, and that's the law. Now, we have had statutory changes, not constitutional changes. We have had statutory changes before. The statutory changes, they're kind of a band-aid. They last for a couple of years, and then they figure out a way to work around them, and they disappear. For example, we had Graham Rudman, and that was a statutory change, and that did work for a while. But it obviously there was a workaround, and the Congress figured out how to get around it, and basically threw the thing into the rubbish. But the Constitution is the Constitution. It's a little harder to get around that. So that's why I think the way to go is a constitutional change.
Let's discuss entitlements. This is something that, of course, people want to avoid. We have, obviously welfare. We have housing voucher programs. Now we have student loan forgiveness. We have mortgage loan forbearance. Over 1 million households have taken advantage of the mortgage loan modifications. What are your thoughts on entitlements? I'm not saying, should we have welfare, not have welfare, but it seems like this has been sort of the path that certainly the current administration is on. And we have Kamala Harris talking about, if she's president, $25,000, up to $25,000 available for eligible first-time home buyers. And when you're looking at a deficit, more deficit spending than we have in the history of the United States, the debt that we have, what do you think about these entitlements?
Well, entitlements, as that word implies, a synonym would be rights, that you have the right to. The only right that we have in the Constitution actually is the right to trial by jury. That's the only thing that actually is in the Constitution. So all of this is made up. These entitlements or rights that.
Well, they say that they're federal entitlements, federal law, or
Hanke. So in principle. In principle, I'm a skeptic about all these so-called rights that you can invent just out of thin air. Now, does Hanke have the right to receive something? And if I have the right to receive it, where do we get the money? Do we get it from Sachs? Through the political system, do I have the right to put a gun at your head and rob you just because I have the right, because some law has been passed to receive $25,000 to buy a home or whatever it happens to be? So that's the problem. These things are really theft, because the money has to come from somebody. And they aren't voluntarily coughing up the money. If all of a sudden Hanke has the right to something, and that has to be paid for by Sachs, and Sachs doesn't agree to this, that's like somebody coming in with a gun and saying, "Open your wallet, Sachs, and you give me your money."
They're saying that's okay. That's the people that we're putting in place, right?
Well,
that's who we're electing.
That's the mentality. That's the entitlement mentality, that people have rights somehow for whatever reason. They have the right to this and the right to that and the right to that. As I say, if you really go back and are hardcore about it and look at the Constitution, there is one right in the Constitution that Americans have, and that is they have the right to a trial by jury. But all these other things are not in the Constitution.
So what would you change, and how would you do it? You have so many people that are dependent. In fact, so we'll continue down this path, because we have some pretty big. You talk about laws that are passed that, obviously take money from, through taxation primarily. And
Well, this is a real problem because, for example, uh, Social Security is kind of a mixed bag because let's say if I was to draw Social Security, well, some of what I get I've actually paid in a long time ago, so I have contributed to it, but to the extent that I'd be receiving payments that weren't financed by me, they'd have to be financed by somebody else, and that's an entitlement. So generically, even though it's kind of a mixed thing, the Social Security, it's considered as an entitlement. Now, if you get it, and there's a big issue about solvency of this thing, because the only way you really can keep the system going, given the way it works, is you got to have more and more young people actually financing old timers. Like money that we receive would have to be forked up by younger people who are actually working in the labor market. So if you touch that, there's an explosion. There was a movement with George W. Bush to put in private Social Security, and it created a firestorm, and that proposal was dropped right away. So the only way you can do that, by the way, which would be a great idea to have private Social Security, is to basically say those who are already in the system are going to stay in the system. We're not going to take anything away from you, and but the new ones, you pull up the drawbridge and say there are going to be no new entrants in this thing, and we're gonna gradually phase it out. So the transition is the problem with getting a transition away from these entitlements to some other more private approach is a real problem. It's a little bit like, the guy who went down Niagara Falls in a barrel. They announced he was going to go down, and of course they had all the press was there, and the guy goes down, and God, he made it over. He went over the falls and came out at the end, and of course the press was there to interview him, and they said, well, how was it? And he said, well, above the falls it was pretty calm, and 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 it was also not too bad after I got over the falls, but he said the transition was a bitch, and that is the problem. You're transitioning from an entitlement system to a non-entitlement system, which ultimately is going to have to occur because even the Congressional Budget Office is telling us this is not sustainable. And if something is not sustainable, it has to stop. And working out how that transition would work, and what the new alternative would look like is a political can of is a not a can of worm. It's not only a can of worms; it's a hot potato.
They can easily say, it's not sustainable, but it's completely sustainable on my watch. And, and this is the reason why no one wants to make a decision on it, because it's not popular. And,
Yeah, Todd,
what a mess.
yeah, this is a kick your can the can down the road approach. This is so they kick it down the road, kick it down the road. But if it's not sustainable, and you keep kicking it down the road, you're going to eventually meet the day of reckoning when the whole thing explodes.
Well, I guess, I want to talk about the day of reckoning with our current economy. When you look at this recession, I think, you sort of believe we'll have a recession. I think, honestly, anybody with a half a brain, if they consider, the last 4 years and the amount of debt that we've taken on, the current state of the economy, people don't have money. I mean, we're looking at first time buyers. They don't have $5,000 in the bank. When we have a Fed, and central bankers that really aren't looking at the money supply, and they're thinking that the only way that they can bring us in and out of good times or strong economy or create jobs is manipulating the interest rate. I think it's fair to say that we both agree that they've made some pretty big mistakes. All you have to do is look at where we are today. Is that fixable? Is it, if we do go into a recession, a deep recession, how bad would that be? And does it matter who's the president come January 20th? Is it, is this sort of like inevitable to have this recession, or is it possible that someone taking over in January can change policy quick enough or make changes that would prevent a recession altogether?
No, they can't make changes that would prevent a recession, because that's already baked in the cake. That is because of money supply contraction that occurred starting in roughly the summer of 2022. So that thing is baked in the cake. And the only question is, what stupidity might they do in reaction to the recession that's caused by changes in the money supply a long time ago? If a recession hits, the danger is that they'll do some stupidity and make things even worse.
What could they do?
That would be one of my biggest concerns.
Would be giving $25,000 to home buyers be part of that? I mean, what else could they do here that would put us in, any worse of a situation than we are right now?
The $25,000 is just a bad idea, whether you have a recession or not a recession. Again, it's this giveaway. It's a giveaway society, right society. Everybody supposedly has the right to this, the right to that. An entitlement here, an entitlement there. Those are just giveaways, and people have to get it in their head. The giveaway comes out of somebody's pocket, and the pocket it comes out of is not necessarily somebody who would voluntarily give that $25,000 to somebody to buy a new home. So that means it's in effect theft. The government is, it's basically like a street thug. It's like armed robbery.
What about the spending on immigration? What do you think about the current situation with, they say we have a lot of illegal immigrants in the country, that we're busing them all around the country. We're providing them with debit cards, putting them up. What's the end game on that?
It's going to be a game that ends badly. That's in my judgment. Now, if you look at like New York City, for example, the annual cost of financing the facilities for the immigrants, and this is off the top of my head, so it's a rough figure, but it's like $150,000 per immigrant per year, and the average income in the United States is only about $75,000. So it's costing a lot of money, and again, it's a holdup theory. They're requiring some taxpayers. Somebody has to pay for it. It's pretty pricey. It's pretty expensive. So that's the kind of near-term bottom line is it's costing more per illegal immigrant than the average per capita income in the United States, like double. It's a lot of money.
We've spoken before about property taxes, and we know that especially where you live in Baltimore City, it's outrageous. But I want to talk about some policies, because it seems like some of the proposals that are out there seem to be getting even crazier. I don't think, Steve, I don't think enough people, we talked about headline news and things like that. There aren't a whole lot of people that go much deeper than that. And I think that's a big problem with our society overall, is that we really don't spend a lot of time. I mean, you're a professor, you teach, bright students. I firmly believe that your teaching is probably a lot different than a lot of professors of economics. I mean, obviously, who's running our country right now? I mean, could probably learn a couple things from your class. But when we get into a lot of these new bills that are being proposed, they seem like they're getting even crazier. I want to talk about California for a minute because a lot of what happens on the West Coast ends up on the East Coast. And this bill hasn't actually passed yet, but I think it's still active in the legislature. I want to say it's bill number 259, I believe. It has to do with it's a wealth tax and an exit tax. Have you heard anything about this?
In general, not in detail. I haven't read the draft proposal, so I don't know.
So in California in 2023, more than 75,000 Californians left the state. And, a lot of what we saw, in the housing market with the domestic migration was that people were fleeing states that had higher taxes or higher cost of living, implications on their income, right? Things that, or their wealth, take this taking of wealth kind of thing that we talk about. Basically, what they're proposing is to tax the wealthy an exit tax. It would be a one-time tax to leave the state of California. I think it's somewhere around, either 15 million in income or assets. I don't know exactly, but for single people, 30 million or whatever for, married couples. But my point is, as we look for, and we're talking about the economy, it almost seems like the direction of a lot of these states, and we're talking about federal, a lot of the things that we're talking about here are federal decisions that are being made that, tax people more and give these entitlements. But what about the states? I mean, what do you see when we're talking about craziness like that, where they can actually tax somebody for leaving a state?
Well, so
this sounds very communist to me.
yeah. Well, that number one, I can't imagine that would be ruled as being something that would be constitutional. So I question kind of the legal validity of that, but that's a practical thing. Just as a matter of principle, it's a terrible idea. And if you look at all the high tax states like California, Maryland, New York, you name it, people are moving out. And this gets into supply side economics. Of course, I'm I might be a monetarist, but I'm also a supply sider. Economics is all about incentives, and that was the main thrust of Reaganomics, where I was one of Reagan's advisors at the Council of Economic Advisors, and it was this kind of stuff would go in the trash pretty fast back in those days. I mean, can you imagine taxing someone because they wanted to move out of your jurisdiction? I don't think that would stand up in court. By the way, the one good thing, supply side and property tax, that actually happened in 1978 in California was Proposition 13, which put a cap on property taxes. And most people don't realize at that time, San Francisco was in the tank. It was going down the tubes because of property taxes. As soon as Prop 13 came in, within 3 years, San Francisco is booming. They also put a tax cap, Prop 2.5 in Massachusetts a few years later, and exactly the same thing happened. Most people think Boston, has always been a booming, innovative place. No, it was tanking. just like San Francisco. Everybody thinks, San Francisco, great place, booming all the time. No, it was tanking. And Boston was the same thing. It was tanking. They put in Prop 2.5 and boom, up. And they've never looked back. So economics is all about incentives. And if you want to put in negative incentives, you're going to get negative results.
Well, I mean, telling people, like you said, that they can't leave. I think what they, I read one article where it said that they're actually people are leaving now faster than they had before because just the thought of, especially the ones that have the money, that fall into this category, the wealthy, that they're even exiting or considering exiting at a faster speed now because this is still an active bill in legislature. So, I mean, and that's what happens is it may not pass right away, but they keep pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. And finally they get enough support to it to pass something like that. But I just think, we're going in a,
Think of it this way. What if actually this became law and was legal, passed muster from a legal point of view, which I don't think it would, but at any rate, you'd have the United States in which you were taxing people to move around within the United States. One of the great things about the United States, number one, it's a huge market, so that gives it geographic firepower is tremendous. But the main thing is the fluidity, the flexibility, the movement in the economy, not only to move geographically around the United States, but the churn, what they call the churn. And if you look at the people who are in an income bracket, they don't stay in that income bracket very long. The churn, if you're down at the bottom of the barrel, chances are within 10 or 20 years, you're going to be moving up a lot. And if you're up on the top end, the churn works the same way. There's a pretty good chance you'll be going down. So there's a lot of movement in the income distribution in the United States, as well as geographic movement of people moving around in the United States. And that dynamism is one thing that has put the United States where it is. It's been good, not bad.
If you had to hope for something, certainly the future of the United States, preserving our freedoms, preserving the Constitution, which they seem to want to change every single minute that they can. Where's the hope? Where's the hope for people that are,
Well, I think the hope is that the hope is that we do have this imposition of Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, and we have a convention of states, and we change the Constitution to include something like a Swiss debt break. That would be a big deal. So you have to change the institutional structure of things. The idea that changing people is the answer is, I think, wishful thinking. You've got to change the rules of the game. And changing the Constitution to include something like the Swiss debt break, that really would be a big deal.
balance the budget?
Balance the budget, and don't let the government grow any more rapidly than the growth in the economy. So that way we would know that the cancer of the government expanding and taking over more and more of the economy, that would stop.
Makes sense. Well, appreciate your talk and all of your information. And I think, there's a lot to unpack here. And I think for those listening, we really need to, we need to push for change. I think that is extremely important right now. We're going down a wrong road, and we'll chat again soon.
We will. In closing, by the way, people can follow me on Twitter at Steve_Hanke, or they can send me an email at Johns Hopkins and get on my distribution list, hanke@jhu.edu.
And we'll make sure all of that information is published below in the show notes. And certainly, until next time, we'll talk to you soon.
Hey, great. Great to be with you, Todd.
Well, I'm glad you made it this far. If you liked the video, you can let Steve and I know that you did by hitting that thumbs up. One of the biggest compliments that you can do for me at Sachs Realty is to share this video with your family and friends so that we can build the most amazing online community together. And if you haven't subscribed to Sachs Realty's YouTube channel, why don't you go ahead and do so now? Hit that alert bell. You'll know every time we upload content just like this. See you on the next video. Sachs Realty, Maryland broker number 607720, office number 443-318-4514, equal housing opportunity.